Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about the new Jim Crow that was in some of your reading for this week, and we'll see if we can't get a little better understanding of what that was about. So, right after the Civil War, there was a short time, when things in the South really looked pretty promising. The African Americans were freed from slavery. Um, we actually had some African Americans entering into the political realm. Things were changing and things were beginning to look good. But it wasn't long after that our economy started to kind of go down. The South or the North was very tired of fighting. So the North did not want to keep troops in the South to make sure that everything was running smoothly. And within 10 years after the end of the Civil War, the South pretty much looked like it did before the Civil War. Now, African Americans were not enslaved again. Slavery was not all of a sudden legal. But there were a new book of laws that were put into place, and they were called Jim Crow laws. And they basically reinstated slavery under a different name. So it was slavery in everything but name. So this is a picture of a school that was able to be opened after the Civil War, and they were called Freedmen's Schools, opened and operated by the Freedmen's Bureau, because during the time of slavery, it was actually illegal to educate an African American. This is a picture of a family that's been reunited, because remember, during the time of slavery, it was a normal occurrence to sell families apart from each other. Mothers, fathers, children, they would be sold to different farms in different states and often never see each other again. The concept of family was not recognized for African Americans. The concept of marriage was not recognized. This is another picture of a freedmen's school. Again, after the Civil War, during the time of the Civil War, it was illegal to educate African Americans. It was illegal to teach African Americans how to read. Okay. Okay, and this is a photograph of some of the first colored African American senators from that time. Again, there was a short time period, about 10 years, where we actually had African Americans serving in the legal and political realm in the South. Unfortunately, that did not last very long. And sorry, I've got ads popping up here all over the place. Okay, this is another photo of Black legislature during the time. Okay, and this period after the Civil War, when things were looking pretty good for African Americans, was called the time of Reconstruction. However, if you look at this photograph, you will see that all was not smooth sailing. This is an interesting excerpt from a newspaper or a poster, and it's really racist and it's really awful. It's portraying a Black African American who is, they're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau. It is just made to allow African Americans to lay around and not do anything while other people work and pay all their expenses. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. Just a really racist take. And again, we see, what does it take to perpetrate racism? Dehumanizing whoever you are, seeking to portray as less than you. Okay, and here you have another really racist poster. Every radical in Congress voted for Negro suffrage. That means African Americans vote. Every radical in the Pennsylvania Senate voted for Negro suffrage. Stevens, Forney, and Cameron are for Negro suffrage. They are all candidates for the United States Senate. No radical newspaper opposes Negro suffrage. Gary said in a speech at Harrisburg, 11th of August, 1866, there can be no possible objection to Negro suffrage. So basically what this ad is saying is that if you believe that it is good to get black people to vote, then you are in some way deranged or radical or not thinking clearly. Here are some photos of people protesting Jim Crow, and this is more of a modern photo. I would say this looks to be probably in the 60s. The presence of segregation is the absence of democracy. Jim Crow must go. Again, that looks probably 60s, I would guess. Here lies Jim Crow. Let our parents vote. Let our parents register. We need free elections. Again, the style of dress, this looks to be the 60s. The Civil War had ended over 100 years before this, and people, African Americans, still were not able to register to vote and vote with any type of freedom. And you have these kids out protesting for their parents to be allowed to vote and register. Okay, this is an example of a Jim Crow law from the South. Colored waiting room. Very typical. You found these things all over the South. Colored drinking fountains, colored entrances, colored bus areas, taxi cabs, you name it. This is a kind of a racist portrayal of the happy-go-lucky African-American person, kind of belying the pain and suffering that they really were put through. We want white tenants in our white community. Very welcoming billboard to people of color to move into their community. I mean, and supported by the American flag. How ironic, right? Liberty, democracy, freedom, equality is being used to align with this type of sentiment, which has no place in a democracy. Colored entrance, very typical. And again, obviously, the segregation with the different entrances, the different drinking fountains, it was not equal yet different. It was vastly unequal. The African American entrances, the colored entrances were horribly inadequate and less than the white sections. Okay, again, I would say this is probably 60-ish. All right, when people are still trying to do away with Jim Crow. And Jim Crow were the laws on the books that instituted segregation. So you would have thought that those Jim Crow laws had been done away with many years ago. But unfortunately, they were not. And that's just something we've had to live with. Okay, so when we talk about the new Jim Crow, what are we talking about? Is someone instituting those types of segregation and instituted laws that say, you know, African American entrance, African American drinking fountain, etc.? Well, no. What the new Jim Crow is talking about is really a rebirth of a caste-like system in our country, and one that has literally resulted in millions of African American males locked up in our criminal justice system, and then relegated to really a permanent second-class status, denied those very rights that they supposedly won in the civil rights movement. Okay, so what does that mean? What in the world does that mean? Well, if you will remember, when Barack Obama was elected president, a lot of people celebrated this as a triumph over race. With Obama's election, racism was dead. The majority of black men in major urban areas during this time were either under the control of the penal system, or they were saddled with criminal records for life that made it very difficult for them to be employed, find housing, all those type of things. Jim Crow laws were literally wiped off the books decades ago. But today, an extraordinary large percentage of African American people are warehoused in prisons or trapped in a parallel social universe. They're denied basic civil and human rights, including the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, and the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. Today, it's no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. Yet, as civil rights lawyer turned legal scholar Michelle Alexander demonstrates in her book, The New Jim Crow, that nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans are back under a different form. So once labeled a felon, even for a minor drug crime, the old forms of discrimination are suddenly legal again. In Alexander's words, we have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. So Alexander really shows that by targeting black men through the war on drugs and disseminating communities of color, the U.S. criminal justice system functions as a contemporary system of racial control, even as it formally adheres to the principle of color blindness. Pretty interesting and pretty provocative statements there. This provocative suggestion that we are in a time of a new Jim Crow is something that is really worth considering and really worth thinking about. If indeed we are in a new Jim Crow time, that will be very, very sad, because segregation, racism, prejudice, all of that is never acceptable, and it never brings out the best in anyone. Okay, here's a really telling photograph of a dog that is being used on an African American man, probably someone who is trying to advocate for voter rights or registration, and this was a fairly common occurrence that dogs were used to keep people in line. Okay, well, that will be it for today. I hope that you have enjoyed this, and it'll be interesting to talk about things in class on Thursday. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.